outcomes. So I'm excited to hear the first talk. And with that, Bronwyn, please introduce Victor.
Okay, today I have the honor of introducing our very first undergraduate complexity researcher of the summer, which is incredibly exciting. Victor Odouard is a rising senior at Cornell, majoring in mathematics with a self-designed second major in complexity science. For his virtual summer research, he studied how communication and cooperation have co-evolved. Victor is also interested in understanding dynamics of groups and using that knowledge to learn about and create a theory of anarchy. As a part of the Data Analytics Club at Cornell, Victor helped to create a matchmaking algorithm for Valentine's Day to increase club interaction with the student body. And it turned out that half of the undergraduate students signed up for the service, which beat out signups for Harvard's data match algorithm. So without further ado, here is Victor.
Thanks for the intro, Bronwyn. So I'll share my screen. Thank you all for coming. I can't say I was expecting such a large turnout, but yeah. So let's get started. I want to talk to you guys today about communication, cooperation, coevolution. These things are very interesting because there's sort of a bi-directional relationship between the two. Communication enhances cooperation by allowing for greater coordination, and cooperation may have provided the selection pressure necessary for communication to have emerged. So I want to understand this coevolution process a little better. In particular, I want to ask the question, is the coevolution of cooperation and communication sufficient to stabilize a state in which cooperation levels are high and communication is effective? And the answer is yes, but terms and conditions apply. And I want to walk you through exactly how I got to this conclusion. So the plan is to first do some background. I'll introduce like what cooperation is for our purposes. I'll talk about indirect reciprocity and show how indirect reciprocity acts as a bridge between cooperation and communication. Then I'll talk about the model. First, a basic indirect reciprocity model. Then I'll add in features that will allow us to model the coevolution process. And then I'll talk about previous results with this model and why I'm a little bit suspicious of them, which will bring me to the experimentation phase, which will essentially consist of me sort of playing whack-a-mole with invading strategies, non-communicators, non-cooperators, and adding features to the model to try to quash those invaders, hopefully without sacrificing any realism. And finally, I'll conclude with 3 sufficient conditions for high levels of cooperation and effective communication. So let's get started. The background, communication, indirect reciprocity, and cooperation, indirect reciprocity, and communication. So what is cooperation? For our purposes, we can say that it's paying a private cost C for the benefit B of others, where B and C are numbers and B is greater than C, because we want there to be some kind of collective benefit for cooperating. So we can model this kind of like a prisoner's dilemma, where here there's a matrix of your payoffs. Your action is on the row axis, your opponent's action is on the column axis, and if you guys both participate, then you pay the cost to cooperate, but you also gain the benefit from your partner cooperating. So your payoff is B minus C. Then if you cooperate and your partner defects, then you're kind of out of luck on the benefit, but you still have to pay the cost, so your payoff is negative C. If you defect and your partner cooperates, then you get a freebie benefit, but you have to pay no cost. And finally, if you both defect, you're both kind of out of luck. And so here, the dominant strategy is to defect. You always do better, no matter what your opponent does if you defect. And so a question that people have asked long ago is, how do we get cooperative societies if the dominant strategy is to defect? And a lot of answers to this sort of revolve around iterated prisoners' dilemmas, where maybe agents will be more likely to cooperate if they feel like they'll meet each other again. And so one example of a strategy in this iterated prisoner's dilemma is tit for tat or reciprocal altruism, where you basically act how your partner previously acted towards you. So the way this might look is if we have circle and square, they're meeting in a prisoner's dilemma, and circle cooperates and square defects. This was just kind of an arbitrary choice for the first round. Then in the next round, circle will remember that square defected against me, so I'm going to punish him by defecting. And so circle defects, but square, on the other hand, is like, oh, well, I remember circle, she's kind of a cooperator, so I'm gonna cooperate with her. And so now circle has turned into the defector and square has turned into the cooperator. This strategy outperformed many other strategies in tournament style play, and it can lead to predominant cooperation. But there is a problem with it, which is that what if agents are unlikely to meet again? Maybe there's a big population and agents don't really repeatedly interact very much. So what happens then? This is where the idea of indirect reciprocity comes in. So here, instead of I cooperate with people who have cooperated with me, instead I say, I'll cooperate with those who generally have a reputation for cooperating. So the way this would work is we have circle and square again, and circle cooperates, square defects. And then pentagon comes in, and pentagon has never seen circle before. So pentagon doesn't really know what to do here until square can send a signal maybe to pentagon saying, oh, circle is a cooperator. And so pentagon is vaguely aware of this and then cooperates with circle because of this kind of reputation. But this leads to a question. And the question is, well, how did this communication come to be? The signal dissemination process requires some kind of communication. So where did it come from? And the hypothesis that I want to explore here is the coevolution hypothesis, which kind of says that yes, communication enhances cooperation through this indirect reciprocity mechanism that I just talked about. But also, cooperation may have provided, the necessity for cooperation may have provided the selection pressure for communication to emerge. And so I want to try to model this. I'll start talking about a basic indirect reciprocity model where there won't be any coevolution. Then I'll talk about how we can add in features of the model so that this coevolution is happening. This essentially amounts to making communication evolvable. And I'll also talk about previous results and how we can move on from there. So as a reminder, the question was, is the coevolution of cooperation and communication sufficient to stabilize a state in which cooperation levels are high and communication is effective? So the goal of the model is to first abstractly model the cooperation communication coevolutionary process, and then test for the stability of the cooperative and the communicative strategies. So let's start with the basic indirect reciprocity model. It's repeated prisoner's dilemmas, agents are paired up randomly, and there's this feature where there's a binary reputation number that agents get from the previous round. So if an agent defects in the previous round, their reputation number is a 0. If they cooperate in the previous round, their reputation number is a 1. And agents can take this reputation number into account and use that to decide whether to cooperate or defect. So the agent action strategies are a mapping from their partner's reputation numbers to an action. So this can get a little bit iffy, and I'll come back to it a lot. So if there's any part you want to pay attention to, it's here, or you could just tune me out for the rest of the talk. I guess either one works. And so there's 4 strategies. Each is represented by 2 bits. Here are the 4 strategies. The first bit represents what you do if your opponent is marked with a 0. So the first 2 strategies, you cooperate if your opponent is marked 0. The second 2 strategies, the last 2 strategies, you defect if your opponent is marked 0. And then the second bit corresponds to what you do if your opponent is marked with a 1. So how does this work? We'll do a little bit of an example run. So we have CC, which is someone who always cooperates. We have DC, the discriminator. This language will also come back again. So the discriminator is the strategy that discriminates between the different signals, the different marks of the opponent. So DC here, and DD, so always defects. And what happens is we have these square and circle, they meet. DD defects according to their strategy, CC cooperates, and then they receive a mark. So square defected, so square gets a 0 mark, circle cooperated, so circle gets a 1 mark. And then in the subsequent round, pentagon comes in, and pentagon can see, oh, look, square has a 0 mark, and my strategy tells me to defect against those with 0 marks. And so pentagon decides to defect. So how do we add coevolution to this model? The issue was that signals were fixed. All defectors got marked with a 0, all cooperators were marked with a 1. So the communication was kind of hard-coded into the model. So the way we change this is we take this fixed signaling scheme that was kind of a feature of the environment. It was a global thing that all agents shared. And then we make it evolvable. We move the signaling from the global environment to the individual agent, and we allow agents to evolve their own signaling strategies. And so agents can mark each other kind of however they please, and this is another feature that evolves. So how do we encode this? The 2-bit strategies that I talked about before become 4-bit strategies. And so this will also come back again and again. So the first 2 bits are the same as before. They're the action bits. The first slot is how do I act with 0s? Second slot is how do I act with 1s? But now we add something, which is the signal bits. And the signal bits tell us how do I mark defectors and how do I mark cooperators. So one example of a strategy might be DCO1. And this I'll actually come back to this later because it's an important strategy. But for now, yeah, this is kind of how we encode these dual action and signaling strategies. And so an example of this is agents act and mark now according to their strategies. So let's say we have DD10 meeting CC11 in an interaction. DD means always defect, CC means always cooperate, so they defect and cooperate respectively. And then in the action phase, square then looks at circle, DD10 looks at circle and says, oh, look, circle cooperated. So that means according to my marking scheme, I mark circle with a 0. And then circle marks square with a 1 since that's what circle always does in this case. And then subsequently, pentagon comes in, pentagon the discriminator, sees that circle is marked with a 0 and then defects. Circle, on the other hand, cooperates since circle strategy says, I'm going to always cooperate. So the problem here is that agents are now kind of speaking gibberish. They're sending meaningless tokens at first. And so when can we say that this signaling scheme for these agents actually holds meaning? Because if we are kind of picking strategies out at random and assigning them at random, then one can mean anything. It can mean defect, it can mean cooperate, it can mean nothing at all if an agent just signals 1 on everybody, right? So when does this mapping from your partner's action to a signal actually convey meaning? And there are 2 criteria for this that I'm going to lay out. The first is uniformity, that all agents agree on a particular mapping. And the other one is that we want the mapping to be separating. We want it to be basically a one-to-one function, so it can distinguish between states of the world. If an agent is just marking everybody with a 1, that's really not communicating any information at all. And so we want this separating component to be part of the definition of effective communication. So this is what effective communication is. And so now I'll go back to the question, which asks when we want to ask if a state of high cooperation and effective communication is stable. But what strategy leads to a state of high cooperation and effective communication? The answer to that is the DCO1 strategy. Why? Because if there's a dominance of DCO1s, that means we have effective communication. We have that all agents agree on the mapping. We also have that the mapping is 1-to-1, the signal mapping. And we also have high levels of cooperation because the DC strategy rewards cooperation, it cooperates with cooperators, and it punishes defection. So this is a strategy that leads to the conditions that we're looking for. Just as a disclaimer, the CD10 strategy also works. The order of the bits doesn't really matter as long as the action bits mirror the signal bits. But without loss of generality, we'll just look at the DCO1 strategy. And the question is this strategy stable? Is the dominance of this strategy stable? And this leads us to kind of a rephrasing of the question from before, which is the coevolution of cooperation and communication sufficient to stabilize dominance of the DCO1 strategy? Because a yes to this question implies a yes to the original question, since DCO1 leads to effective communication and high cooperation. So the previous result, due to Smead, is no, almost never. And I wanted to understand if this was a fact about some kind of inherent features of the coevolution of cooperation and communication by indirect reciprocity, or if it was some kind of artifact of the model, and that if we made some modifications, then we could get some different outcomes. And so this led me to my experimentation phase, where I looked at the instability of the high cooperation effective communication strategies. I looked at which strategies invaded, and then I added components to the model to try to increase the stability, hopefully without sacrificing the realism of the model, though. And so you can be the judge of that, I guess. So let's get started with this. So first, I should say what it means to assess evolutionary stability. Evolutionary stability just means that no initially rare strategy can become dominant or invade. And so what I did was I analytically derived the expected payoffs of the dominant strategy. So in this case, it's the DCO1 strategy versus the invaders. And I wanted to see if that payoff was higher. And I made some simplifications. I said, we're doing an infinite population case and we're assuming infinite interactions per generation. So for the base model, what happens is, well, it's kind of a mess. There are 16 possible strategies and 8 of them invade. And so what's going on here? There's really 2 problems. The first is that there's no way to distinguish between the CC strategies, the always cooperate strategies, and the DC strategies. And the reason for this is, in a world dominated by DCO1, so we're testing stability in the world dominated by DCO1, the purple strategy, this is a cooperative world. Everybody is cooperating. So we can say that the first bit of the strategy is almost like an unexpressed gene. It never comes out. So it can never play a role in the selection process. What you do to a defector is completely irrelevant in a world where there are no defectors. And so that's one problem. The other problem is that different languages the language you speak is irrelevant to your payoff. So if CC has a good payoff, then any language that employs the CC action strategy will have a good payoff, no matter if your language is absolutely non-conforming or whether it does conform. So these are the 2 problems that we will start with. It brings us to our first mole, which is that signaling has no bearing on fitness. This is an issue. And so the way that we remedy this is through an idea called meta-signaling, which Smead also tested out in his model. And so what we do with meta-signaling is that with some probability, P, we add an observer to each interaction. And if the observer agrees with the signal that was sent by the signaler, then the observer marks that signaler as a cooperator. Otherwise, the observer marks the signaler as a defector. So this places some pressure on signaling in the correct way that's still kind of endogenous to this model. And so the way this would look is we have square and circle, they meet up, say, and then we have pentagon now, the discriminating observer over here, and say that circle cooperates, but square in an act of defiance decides to mark circle with a 0. And so what happens then is, well, pentagon disagrees with this marking. Pentagon would have marked circle with a 1. So pentagon now marks square with a 0. So we have this kind of meta enforcement of languages going on. And what happens here is that we have an improvement. We've whacked, I guess, 4 out of the 8 invading strategies, but there is still a problem. The first is that we haven't solved the indistinguishability between CC and DC part. And the second problem is that we have an analogous problem with the languages. The first bit of the language is also irrelevant. The reason being that the way I mark defectors is completely unexpressed in a world where there are no defectors. So we need to modify something so that we can kind of express these unexpressed genes. And so yes, this is our second mole, that CC versus DC and 0, 1 versus 1, 1 are indistinguishable. And so how do we remedy that? And there's a very basic fix. It's by adding some error, some shaky hand to this model. And so what this looks like is, with some probability epsilon, agents deviate from their prescribed strategy. And maybe somewhat counterintuitively, this allows us to discriminate between the CC versus DC strategies and the 0, 1 versus 1, 1 strategies, because the error sort of brings out these genes that were previously hidden or unexpressed. And so the way that works is that we have, say we want to, say there's an agent that sends non-conforming signals. So circle here signals 1 on everybody. So that's non-conforming. So circle and pentagon meet up, and pentagon by accident, by this error scheme, defects, because that sometimes happens with probability epsilon. And what happens is circle still marks pentagon with a 1. So circle is now caught in the act of having an unconforming signal, which they would, circle would never have been caught for that in the past without the error. So this is some progress. So what do the payoffs look like for these agents when there's error? It looks something like this. So I graphed the payoffs versus the level of error. And this is the result. The purple line is the cooperator. The red line is the defector, and the white line is the discriminator. And as you can see, the discriminator sometimes outperforms defectors and sometimes outperforms cooperators, but it never outperforms both. And so that's a problem if we want the discriminating strategy to be stable. And so I thought, why is it that discriminators never outperform both of the other strategies? And the reason is that error leads to more defection. And then more defection leads to discriminators punishing those defectors by defecting. So the discriminators are now defecting, and in the subsequent round of that, after that punishment, that discriminator will get punished for having punished a defector. And so, yeah, so discriminators are essentially getting punished for punishing defectors, and that leads to them being less fit, having lower payoffs than cooperators. So this is our last mole. It's that discriminators get punished for defecting. And the way that we can fix that, it seems, is through some kind of a little bit more of a nuanced signaling scheme, because it looks like if we can, it looks like it's a flaw of the signaling scheme that we're punishing discriminators for defecting against defectors. That should be an admirable behavior, punishing defectors, enforcing cooperation. And so we need a more nuanced signaling scheme to make this happen. And so this signaling scheme is inspired by Otsuki's paper in 2005, which says that the signal, if the signal depends both on the action of the agent and the mark of their partner, then we have an increased level of nuance. So the way this works is we have the partner's mark and the agent's action. And the partner can be marked with a 0, and the agent can defect. And so that's one possible scenario. Or the partner's marked 0 and the agent cooperates. That's another scenario. Or the partner's marked 1 and the agent defects, or the partner's marked 1 and the agent cooperates. And the signaling scheme says, for each of these scenarios, I'm going to come up with this, I'm going to have a signaling rule. And the question is, in this signaling scheme, is there a strategy that rewards punishing defectors while still generally encouraging cooperation? And the answer is yes. It's this one. So now the strategies are 6 bits. The first bit says, if your opponent is a 0 and you defect, that's a thumbs up. That's a good thing. That's punishing a defector. But if your opponent is a 0 and you cooperate, that's a bad thing, because you're basically helping the enemy here. And then if your opponent is a 1 and you defect, that's a bad thing too. you're defecting with a friend. And if your opponent is a 1 and you cooperate, that's good. And so with this signaling scheme, maybe we can stabilize an effective communication and high cooperation state if there's more nuance to the signaling. And so I looked at the payoffs for this more elaborate strategy set, and sure enough, here's the payoff graphed as a function of error. And we see that discriminators for sufficiently low levels of error do better than any other strategy. They do better than the cooperators, defectors, and the reverse discriminators. The reverse discriminators are the ones who cooperate with zeros and defect with ones. And so, well, here there's only 4 strategies on the graph, and there are 64 possible strategies for these 64 for the 6-bit scheme. So where are those 64 strategies? Well, I only graphed the strategies with the conforming communication systems, and then I also proved that if you have a non-conforming communication system, you will do worse than your conforming communication system variant. So there's 16 different types of cooperators. They all have different types of communication systems, but the conforming one does the best. So the fact that the discriminator does better than all of the conforming communication versions means that the discriminator does better than any other strategy. So this means that we have found a stable point, where for reasonably small error, discriminators outperform all of the others. So the verdict is that discriminating conforming communication is stable with low but non-zero error, with meta-signaling, and with nuanced signaling. So to conclude, stable communication can co-evolve with cooperation by indirect reciprocity under a few conditions. First, there must be selection pressure on the language. If there's no selection pressure on the language, then we're just screwed. So that's a really important thing. And we achieve that selection pressure through meta signaling. But then there's still more to be done. We need error to express. What error does is it basically expresses unexpressed genes. It brings genes out of hiding almost. And so this is very important too, to enhance the stability of the point. What's interesting about error is this is not the only model in which error can kind of add stability or add predictability. There's also threshold models where if agents kind of have some error in the way they act, outcomes are more predictable. So this is kind of a neat parallel between this model and other types of models too. And finally, it seems like there's some like minimum threshold of nuance that's required for the communication to actually be stable, which also leads to a question, which is that if you think that communication started off very crude and gained nuance as it evolved, well, the question is, how did it make this first initial leap to nuance? Because for communication to be viable in the first place, it needs to have some level of nuance. So it seems like it has this initial hurdle to clear. So thinking about the initial evolution of communication might be, thinking about that more might be an interesting next question. And that brings me to my next steps. I would like to find out what the basin of attraction is for this stable point that I found, because I haven't done that yet, to see, okay, this is a stable point, but which points actually converge to this stable point. Then I want to see the impact of mixed strategies and how this impacts the stability that's going on. And finally, I want to look at the finite case. Usually what happens is in the infinite case, you have 0 probability of invasion. And in the finite case, there's some small probability of invasion. And I want to know how small that small probability is, if it's really negligible. And so I can, that looks like also a next step for this project. So that concludes the talk. I want to thank my mentors, Mike Price, Hajime Shimao. They helped me out so much. I'm at every step, just like coming up with the question, like couldn't have done it without them. Also Melanie Mitchell, unofficially my mentor, she really helped out a ton too. And I also want to thank John, Jessica, Chris, Helena, and Albert for the valuable advice they gave me at all kinds of different stages of the project. And finally, the support of Chris, Carla, and Carrie, and obviously my fellow UCRs for creating such a warm and supportive environment. And also thank you for to the National Science Foundation for their funding. So yeah, that's everything. And I can take questions. Thanks for listening.
Great, thank you so much, Victor. Are there any questions for Victor? Yeah, Chris Moore.
So thank you very much. Lovely talk. I also love the aesthetics of your slides.
Thank you.
So when you described this nuanced communication, if I understand correctly, when you first showed it, it looked like, okay, well, this looks like what people call a norm, right? So basically, we are directly labeling people according to whether they're following the dominant strategy.
Right.
Well, that's intuitive that it would reinforce its dominance. But then later, it sounds like you said more than that. You said that if people have this bit string for any such type of communication scheme, if you will, any norm, that in fact, this is the norm, that this is the stable norm. Is that correct? So in other words, not only does that norm stabilize the original strategy you wanted to stabilize, but that norm is also among the class of strategies that do that kind of nuanced communication based on both the mark and the behavior that they witness, that it's also the stable norm among those norms. Do I understand that correctly?
Well, I guess it wouldn't necessarily be the stable norm. There are
a stable norm.
It is a stable norm. So there could be other stable points. I didn't rule out that possibility. But yes, so this research on norms, that Otsuki's citation was kind of where this is inspired from, and yes, what I am saying is that that particular point is a stable point. I guess the sort of the step I'm taking here is what Otsuki was saying is such and such norms can lead to stable communication. But these norms were kind of society-wide global norms. What we're doing here is we're allowing the norms to evolve on individual levels by allowing agents to signal according to like an individual norm. And we're seeing, can agents with kind of different signaling schemes, which kind of represent their personal norm, invade? And I guess the answer here was no.
I guess my other question is, as you pointed out earlier on, there's a sort of mirror image strategy where 0 and 1 mean the other thing. So there's a sort of issue of evolving an agreed upon meaning of these marks. It would be interesting to know if you start with a kind of random mixture of the cooperators and the mirror image cooperators that are also nice people. They just mean the opposite thing by 0 and 1, whether that mixture would be unstable and the one of the two meanings would eventually become fixated and agreed upon. Right.
Yeah, for sure. That's another further question. And I had coded up a simulation to kind of test that out. I may try to do it analytically. I'm not sure if I'll be able to do that, but either through simulation or through doing additional math, I'll try to answer that question. And my hypothesis is that basically these 2 points will be stable, and then kind of the society will veer in one way or another. But then once one of them is stabilized, then the other one doesn't invade anymore. So that's good, I guess.
Great. So Kate, I was going to read your question from the chat, but I see you have your hand up. So is it the same question or a different question? Either way, it's you.
Yeah, it's the same question.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I could read it.
So I asked, what in the real world of communication is the probability which you were describing, Victor, meant to represent, and the probability of agents deviating from prescribed strategy was the slide I was referring to.
Okay, got it. Yeah. So you mean the epsilon?
Yeah.
Is that what? Yeah. So that just means, so when agents meet up, they have some strategy about whether to cooperate or defect in the prisoner's dilemma. And so, I don't know, I guess in the real world, this might be like if you're in a hunter-gatherer band or something like that, and you can either free ride and not go hunting, but still eat the meat, that's defecting, or you can go hunting and pay the cost of that time that you spend, but then you also still get the benefit. And the probability epsilon just says, well, in general, I would do this thing. This is what my strategy says that I would do. But sometimes, you know, either by accident you defect, or because, I don't know, maybe there's other factors like exogenous to the model that cause you to defect, right? Mm-hmm. And so all of these things are kind of encompassed in this epsilon probability of doing the opposite thing that you would usually do.
I see. I have a follow-up, if that's okay.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, so I guess I was wondering, like, it sounds like it's a catch-all for a lot of different factors, and I was wondering, like, is there a way of disentangling these factors and studying them separately, or like, because I'm not very well read in this field.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think there is. That they would probably, I mean, this is often what happens with these things. Like one model has the certain factors treated as sort of like outside the model, and we just abstract it as like some factor or some number, and then a future modeler decides, well, I want to actually look at these things into more detail, and so that modeler kind of disentangles those things from that abstracted initial model and tries to sort of, yeah, I don't know, disentangle and have the model model explicitly each of these different factors, maybe. So yeah, I mean, for sure, there is a possibility of disentangling these factors. I guess there's always just the trade-off of like how complex do you want to make the model, and because as you kind of add more moving parts, and this was a problem I had earlier on, as I had more moving parts, like it just became super difficult to first derive any mathematical results, and also make any sense of the output, even if I was simulating it or anything like that. So yeah, the answer is yes, I guess.
Thanks.
I think we have time for two quick questions, and we've got one from David Kinney and then one from David Krakauer. So David Kinney, go for it.
Great, thanks. And thanks, Victor, for such a great talk. Just a quick clarifying question. When you say you proved that conforming communicators outperform non-conforming communicators, is that in expectation, or is that in all possible scenarios, like a kind of dominance argument?
I proved it in expectation. So the thing with infinite interactions per generation is that then the payoff then converges to the expected payoff. However, thinking about it, it is actually true that a non-conforming communicator can never do better. Like even in individual interactions, can never do better than the conforming communicator version. So
thanks.
I can say that with 95% confidence, but.
Great, and then Krakauer wrote, or if you'd like to.
I can. Thanks, Victor. That was I have to echo Chris's dark mode aesthetics on your slides. Works for me.
Inspired by 3 blue, 1 brown. If you guys are.
Yeah. So the question is, there is a sort of a tendency in building models like this to find a little bit of a snag and add an epicycle, and you added 3. And that's fine, because maybe that's what life does, right? Philosophically, there's an idea from Jacob and Monod that life tinkers, right? So it's kind of a mess. But there are these solutions which are more universal. And the one that I know is the sortativity, right? That like interacts with like. So you had a fully mixed model. If you added some sortativity, like spatial structure, you could probably eliminate 2 of your epicycles. I'm just wondering whether you've thought about that.
Yeah, I did. So initially I was thinking about like kind of locating agents in a social network maybe, and then they could have some preference for interacting with certain people, certain other agents, something like that. So yes, that is another that is another possible way, possible avenue. And I think that there have been results about, so if there's some kind of assortativity, I think there have been results that have been promising for the evolution of communication. And so, yeah, I guess this was sort of modeling a different type of scenario. I guess there are certain, it is possible that maybe a well-mixed environment models certain situations better or not. And so, yeah, I guess this definitely looks at the well-mixed case as a simple start. And then maybe I will go in and try to see what I can find out in a more, where agents are either spatially located or located in a social network or something like that. But yes, definitely the assortativity does help with the evolution of communication.
Great, thank you.
Great, well, thanks again, Victor and everyone. So let's thank Victor again.